No matter how I would reach out in the years to come to find an identity and purpose of my own, I would remain inextricably tied to my twin brother. In my life, I would marry more than once. I would have children of my own. My detractors accused me of being a smuggler, a spy, a mafia associate, once even a drug dealer, and an agent of all intelligence and counterintelligence agencies in the world. Western newspapers christened me the Black Panther of Iran. Looking back now, I smile when I think of the convoluted, almost superhuman feats of manipulation that were attributed to me. I think it was the fact that I was a woman working actively in politics, then an exclusively male domain, which raised eyebrows and set tongues wagging.
Princess Ashraf Pahlavi of Iran was independent, outspoken, and controversial. A woman of style, a lover of jazz, an incessant target of gossip, and a close confidant of her beloved brother, the Shah of Iran. But she also met with many heads of state, campaigned for the impoverished, worked diligently to combat illiteracy, and was a fervent advocate for human rights and women's rights. This is her legacy. Born in 1919, she was the twin sister of the future Shah of Iran. Growing up, she spent as much time as she could in activities with her brother and his friends.
I suppose I became what Americans called a tomboy. I liked the idea of being female, though I never accepted the structured roles that were imposed on women. The male's role, with all its options and prerogatives, seemed infinitely more interesting.
Her father, Reza Shah Pahlavi, was a decorated soldier and an imposing figure of authority. After World War I, he was determined to modernize the country and restructure the government, particularly its administrative, financial, and judicial systems. During his reign, he also built railways and roads, expanded industrial infrastructure, made primary education compulsory, and established the university system. Her mother, Queen Taj al-Muluk, was also a pillar of strength.
In her own way, she was as forceful as he was. At a time when Iranian women were veiled and hidden, when they had virtually no rights, when they were expected to submit totally to male authority, my mother wasn't afraid to argue with my father or challenge his decisions.
In 1936, Reza Shah took a bold step towards women's rights when he abolished the traditional veil and publicly presented the Queen and his two daughters unveiled to the people of Tehran.
My father was always a deeply religious man, but he realized that many of the practices and customs that contributed to Iran's backward condition were relics of social traditions and not fundamental to the religion of Islam. The mullahs saw it quite correctly as a threat to their authority and to the body of ancient tradition, of which they made themselves the guardians. There is an important distinction here between what is written in the Quran and the interpretation of it by individual mullahs.
But in 1939, Germany invaded Poland, plunging the world into war. Her father's quest to modernize Iran came to an abrupt halt. Needing a supply route to Russia, British and Soviet forces invaded and occupied Iran, forcing Reza Shah to abdicate in 1941. Her brother, Crown Prince Mohammad Reza, became the new Shah of Iran. Her father was exiled to South Africa. As the war raged on, Princess Ashraf traveled to Johannesburg to visit him.
Johannesburg resembled many European cities, but the beauty of the city was marred by the cruel and highly visible signs of segregation. Theaters, restaurants, parks, beaches, and even sidewalks were segregated. This made a deep and lasting impression on me, one that many years later, during my first term at the UN, would draw me directly to the Human Rights Commission.
This awakening to the plight of others continued when she returned to war-torn Iran.
The first time I went into the Tehran slums to see for myself what kind of help is most needed, I literally became ill. I had always known, at least intellectually, that there were people less fortunate than I, people who could not take for granted a comfortable place to live, enough to eat and clothes to wear. But I had never seen with my own eyes the kind of day-to-day misery that breeds apathy and despair.
From that moment on, she had found a purpose. She started the Social Services Foundation, which became the Imperial Organization for Social Services. In time, the organization helped establish more than 300 clinics and hospitals across Iran. After the war, a crisis was brewing when Russia refused to leave occupied Azerbaijan. Under the guise of her social welfare work, she traveled to Russia, ostensibly to learn about their welfare system, but the real purpose was an unofficial meeting with Stalin to discuss Russian-Iranian relations. It was the first of her unofficial foreign diplomatic missions. At the end of their meeting, Stalin called her a true patriot. Faced with a U.S. ultimatum, Stalin decided to pull out of Iran, but he demanded a share of Iranian oil, which the British had been exploiting for decades. Iran rid itself of both Soviet demand and British exploitation by nationalizing its oil in 1951, an effort led by the charismatic Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh.
The Near East became another world trouble spot with the nationalization and seizure of the world's largest oil refinery in Abadan in Iran.
But with that came enormous political turmoil and economic hardship. The crisis came to an end in 1954 with the formation of a multinational consortium of oil companies contracted to the Iranian government. With the resumption of the flow of oil and income, the Shah embarked on a campaign of significant social, economic, and political reforms. The most substantial was the 6-point reform package called the White Revolution, which included land reform and women's suffrage. These were strongly opposed by the clerics, but received overwhelming popular support. The princess became a key proponent for women's rights. She was instrumental in pulling together local grassroots organizations and forming the High Council of Women's Organizations in 1959, which later became the Women's Organization of Iran.
Our principal aim was to integrate Iranian women into every facet of society and to recreate the condition of equality our female ancestors had enjoyed centuries ago. We worked for economic equality through vocational training, literacy, consciousness raising, international contact, and a better understanding with women of other countries.
Through their hard-fought efforts, women gained the right to vote in 1963 and demanded access to all levels of public office. Women soon were elected to parliament and appointed judges and cabinet ministers. As a result, significant reforms to family law were achieved, including raising the age of marriage to 18, recognizing a wife as an equal partner in marriage, in divorce, and child custody matters. It also imposed strict limitations on polygamy. Literacy being key to economic development, over 12,000 literacy corps women were deployed to rural villages to teach. By the late 1970s, the literacy rate for girls increased significantly, and 33% of university students were women. The princess's work on literacy expanded internationally as well, serving on both the International Consultative Liaison Committee for Literacy and the National Committee for World Literacy. Beginning in the 1960s, the princess began her work at the UN, where she served for 16 years.
When I came to the UN, it was with the issue of human rights first and foremost on my mind. I felt I had arrived at the natural end of a long road one I had traveled in my mind ever since I learned about discrimination on the streets of Johannesburg.
Since then, as the cruel discrimination against the black population in South Africa has continued,
She was a member of the UN Human Rights Commission, the Economic and Social Council, and later was named chair of both the Human Rights Commission and the Commission on the Status of Women. She was also head of the Iranian delegation to the General Assembly. In 1968, she served as chair of the UN's first International Conference on Human Rights in Tehran, in which 88 nations participated. It marked the first time in UN politics that the developing countries asserted their demands to focus on social and economic rights, and not just political rights, as the Western countries preferred. The final proclamation which she signed declared, "Since human rights and fundamental freedoms are indivisible, the full realization of civil and political rights, without the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, is impossible." In 1975, she played a major role in the UN's International Year of Women and in planning the first conference on women in Mexico City. 6,000 representatives from 133 countries attended. The conference defined a world plan of action, outlining a comprehensive set of guidelines for the advancement of women through 1985.
abolir les dernières forteresses de la discrimination contre les femmes.
In her address, she spoke of ingrained prejudices against women and urged the continued emancipation of women, not only educated elites, but for the peasants of forgotten lands. When the UN was not in session, she traveled the globe, meeting with many leaders and reformers in the developing world to gain a better understanding of their needs. But as the 70s marched on, unrest was growing in Iran, fueled by a conservative backlash against westernization and allegations of regime corruption and abuse of power. On her last visit to Iran in 1978, the Shah insisted she leave the country for her safety. Knowing the end was near, the Shah and his family left Iran on January 16, 1979, never to return. 2 weeks later, Khomeini returned to Tehran. The Islamic Revolution declared victory.
For me, the news of what was happening to Iran's women was extremely painful. After so many hard-won victories, they were ordered to wear the veil again and were segregated and relegated to second-class status. But they were the first to demonstrate against Khomeini's retrogressive edicts, and many were imprisoned or exiled. Those who continued to protest were faced by mobs brandishing knives and clubs. When I am optimistic, I think that the women of Iran have gone underground and are just waiting for an opportunity to surface and reassert themselves.
Over the years, Iran's women have surfaced and reasserted themselves, despite the knives, the clubs, and the hardships. In her life, she too was the victim of an attempt on her life and endless attacks on her character and morality, and relentlessly accused of financial misconduct. None of these allegations were ever proven. But her contributions to social welfare, literacy, human rights, and women's rights are an undeniable matter of record.